Okay, so our next speaker is Thomas R. Kline. He advises clients on a wide variety of art, museum, and cultural heritage matters, including issues of ownership, theft, authenticity, breach of contract, insurance, and related disputes. Since 1989, he has practiced in litigation, arbitration, and dispute resolution, and he has represented governments, museums, churches, foundations, and families in recovering stolen art and cultural property. He also represents American museums and collectors responding to claims. Tom writes and speaks on art, museum, and cultural property issues and serves on the advisory board of the German English publication Kunst und Recht. For 15 years, he has taught a course in museums and cultural heritage at the George Washington University Museum Studies program. And you can take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Ellie. I'm very pleased to be here. Good morning, everybody. Today, I'm going to talk about 4 cases that will give you an idea of what things are like and what they have been like in the art world, the art market, art litigation without blockchain. So let me share my screen. And I can't see it, but I hope you can. I hope that this is correct. And our title is What Happens Without Blockchain? And this is the classic example. It's called Sevso Treasure, Sevso Silver. It was stolen out of the ground. So you can say it's kind of a false example because there wasn't really a chance to list it on a blockchain, although it was in the market for a while. It's a hoard or group of silver objects that date back to the late Roman Empire. It was in Lebanon. That's where the documents pointed. Appeared on the London market in 1980. It was acquired by the 7th Marquess of Northampton. And as I mentioned, the documents indicated that it was coming out of Lebanon. A major auction house put it up for sale 10 years later in 1990, and the sale was halted when the documents proved to be false. At that point, a series of claims was made, the first by Lebanon, then by Hungary and Yugoslavia, later Croatia when Yugoslavia broke up. Each of them claimed to be the owner under their country's national patrimony laws or antiquities laws, which make the country the owner of property found in the ground. The case went to trial, and each country, I believe Lebanon might have dropped out by that point, the countries that were claiming the hoard put up expert testimony and supposed eyewitness testimony, but it was all very general. Some plates, maybe different sizes. Nobody could really identify exactly where the silver came from. So if I could see you, I would ask, and we were in a classroom, I would say, ask, what happens when there are 3 claimants and none of them can make their case? And the answer is straightforward. The objects go back to the possessor. So the Marquess got to keep them. However, because of the litigation and the questions about ownership, he couldn't do anything with them. And it took 25 years before he was able to sell them. And the buyer was Hungary, which I suppose indicates that Hungary believed most seriously about its claim. But for a long time, the objects were not able to be displayed, not part of any museum exhibition or anything. So this is the problem of lack of clarity of ownership that we're trying to address. So let's talk about the case of the Kanakuria mosaics. This is the first case that I handled when I became an art lawyer. Uh, Cyprus, most Americans don't know. They confuse it with Crete. Who would fly over beautiful Greek islands to go to Cyprus? So it's much better known in Europe. It is a member of the EU. And it's got a bad location. It's just a few miles off the coast of Turkey. So I always say Cyprus is to Turkey as Cuba is to the United States. And obviously near Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt. In 1974, Cyprus was invaded by Turkey, which effectuated a partition. Turkey occupied the northern third of the island and pushed the Greek Cypriots out of that area and attracted Islamic Turkish Cypriots to the north, affecting essentially an ethnic division of the island, although not a legal division because no one in the world except Turkey recognizes the occupied area as an independent country. So the church we're going to look at, called Panahia Kanakuria, was in the occupied area up towards the Karpas Peninsula, this pot handle of Cyprus. And it was occupied for a couple of years by I'm sorry, I don't mean occupied in the military sense. During the military occupation, the residents of the town stayed there for 2 years. After that, they were driven out. And at that point, the mosaics disappeared, let's say between 76 and 79. This is the most famous of the mosaics. It's a composition of adolescent Christ sitting on Mary's robe and archangels on each side. Michael was in pretty good shape, as you can see. And you see these dotted lines, they were put in by the Department of Antiquities and Dumbarton Oaks, which is here in DC, part of Harvard University, which had studied these mosaics and conserved them and published this research report on the frescoes. But then after the occupation of the area and driving out of the Greek Cypriots, the mosaics were stripped from the wall by thieves. You can see this huge Africa-shaped scar that picks up where the Christ was and where the archangel was. This is what the church looks like now. We were able to get a hold of photographs like this for the trial in Indianapolis to try to get these mosaics back. You can see that, again, this huge Africa-shaped scar in the apse. It was on a curved surface in the apse. And you could just barely see the foundation here of an arch. And on that arch were rondelles of the apostles. And two of those apostles also showed up in Indianapolis. There were 4 fragments that had been purchased by an Indianapolis art dealer named Peg Goldberg. Excuse me. And this is a kind of a description of what happened by one of the journalists and authors who followed events after the 74 occupation. There was organized looting that followed or sort of went along at the same time as more normal looting that you would expect in wartime and following wartime. This is a picture of Aidan Diekman with one of the rondelles that I talked about. And this is Michel von Rijn in his book, High Art, Cold Cash. I hate to advertise his book, but he's got the feet of Christ, which was part of that composition that I showed you. So this indicates that he's got stolen property. And the same with Aidan Diekman, who was believed to be the smuggler. Michel van Ryn was a dealer in Amsterdam who facilitated the transaction. So this is the adolescent Christ and the archangel as they appeared in Indianapolis, where they showed up. They could easily be identified in the courtroom because of the book. Now, if there had been a blockchain, of course, the church could have registered these, started a blockchain for them, but nothing was done. Nobody ever thought that these things would be stripped from the walls. Here are the two rondels that we also saw in Indianapolis. If your Greek is good, you can see Matouche, I think it would be in Greek, Matthew, and Jacobus, James. So these are two of the uh, apostles. And here's a book written about it, Sacred and Stolen, by Gary Vican, who was our expert in the trial. Excuse me. And it was the director of the Walters Art Museum. So he tells the story of this case and several others in this book, which I recommend. Uh, but what we can learn from this particular case is the buyer knew that these mosaics had come from what she called the defunct church in Cyprus. She knew that Cyprus was a war-torn island, and yet she went ahead with the purchase, even though she had information. If there had been a blockchain, presumably she would not have been that bold and taken that big a risk. So I want to talk about um, third case, the Augsburg Book of Nobles, which were documented by a museum stamp. This is a page from the book. In German, it's called the Augsburger Geschlechterbuch. It celebrates the entry of 99 families into the nobility. And the families are, each one is portrayed by its seal on a shield. And here is an anonymous looking knight from that family. Later books of nobles had more personalized uh, portraits of the noble. Here over on the left, you can see a museum stamp. Oh, the book was put in a castle for safekeeping, very common practice in Germany because of Allied bombing. But unfortunately, it was put in the town of Waldenburg, which was on a hilltop. German army didn't want to give it up. So this is a Berlin-like street scene of the 63rd Infantry Division going through the town. And here is a close-up of the museum stamp. Now, it was believed that the book showing a different image, here's a shield also of a different family. Uh, the book was believed to be in a castle which burned up, and so the museum's inventory card said gebrunt for burnt. However, it turned out to have been in a warehouse next door, so it did not burn up. And this army officer, who was sort of a one-person crime wave stealing books across Europe, very interested in things that look like costumes. And he took it home to St. Louis, where it remained after his death. And when his widow was downsizing, she called his nephews and said, "Get your uncle's stuff out of here." So they came, recognized that it was very valuable and not shouldn't just go to Goodwill or something. So they sold it to a book dealer. Uh, the officer had told a story about saving books from fire, Nazis burning books. So it just took a little bit of deception for no one in his family to ask, well, where did they really come from and who should have them? Uh, and here is colored pictures of the book, which show how it looked after we recovered it. When we got it back in litigation, uh, the museum, State Art Gallery in Stuttgart, which is in Baden-Württemberg, was so excited they published a catalog. They had an exhibition, and they put the entire book inside the catalog. Um, and here's our hero with the book. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this case is that after the nephews had sold the book to a dealer in St. Louis, that dealer had an auction for other dealers to bid on the book. And so this was the bottom of the art market. The auction was in his bedroom, and the merchandise moved along a folding table as a conveyor belt. And so the rare book dealers of that area of St. Louis bid on a book that had museum stamps on every page. So this is really as good as it gets in terms of pre-blockchain documentation, although Counter Mosaics was also very good because Dunbar Nooks are so prominent and that series of books was so well known. But here you have a museum stamp on every page. Now, if you look up this museum stamp in the literature, you'll see that if the book or the object is deaccessioned from the museum, then there's another stamp that cancels the first one, and that's a deaccession. Deaccession means officially removed from the collection. So here's museum stamps, no deaccession stamps. The book is shown up close and personal to rare book dealers, and nobody asks, what's up with this? Uh, so you see a very low level of ethics in the rare book trade just a few years ago, not that long ago. The dealer who bought it took it to a major auction house, which contacted Stuttgart. Stuttgart claimed the book. They called us. We litigated the case, and we got the book back for the museum. But again, as with the Cyprus case, had there been blockchain available, and had this book been had a chain been created for this book, it would have been very easy to see that it belonged to a museum and could not lawfully be on the market. So I'm going to talk now about a much more recent case than those two, which uh, demonstrates the same point. This is the Museum of the Bible, located in Washington, D.C., opened 2 years ago. You've probably heard about it from Dead Sea Scroll controversies and other issues. It did have a number of legacy issues, and I was hired as their cultural property lawyer to help deal with them. None of what I'm telling you, by the way, is confidential information. It's all public record. So the Museum of the Bible has as its mission to help people connect to the Bible, and it has a collection of ancient documents that concern the history of the Bible. And it had its Hobby Lobby was purchasing many of the books and other objects in the collection and donating them to the Museum of the Bible. Now, the Egypt Exploration Society is a very old organization, been around a long time, premier archaeological research publication society located in Egypt and also in the United States. As an example, here's an excavation that they did with the University of Pennsylvania, which you may know is also a leading institution on antiquities, of something called the Buhen Fortress, which is in southern Egypt and was about to be flooded by Lake Nasser behind Aswan Dam. So it was very important for it to be recorded uh, before the flooding. Uh, so the Egypt Exploration Society has its own collection and did not know that there had been thefts from the collection, which is a cautionary tale. Many thefts of art are not colorful and exciting, but they come out of inventory where there's some inside aspect to it. Insurance people will tell you. So between 2009 and 2013, Hobby Lobby acquired some papyrus fragments for donation to the Museum of the Bible. And these fragments had provenance, placing them in collections in the US, England, and Turkey. So it had no knowledge that they had been stolen, and it was intending to donate them to a museum where, of course, they would be publicly displayed. And if they were stolen, anybody could find them. So MOTB, Museum of the Bible, one of its hallmarks now is working with scholars, conducting research on the objects in its collection. And it consulted with external scholars, prepared to publish these fragments, and it has its own scholars on staff. And somehow through this process, it began to suspect that these fragments were stolen, had come from EES or someplace else. So the mechanism here was primarily EES publishing information about its fragments, and the scholars within the museum and the scholars from EES and the outside scholars the museum contacted, uh, forming a network, uh, which is a good indication to you of what happens even today. But in the absence of blockchain, networks of scholars who know their field in great detail are able to figure out when something is stolen or might not be authentic. But of course, it's a terribly flawed system. It's not comprehensive. And in this case, it only came into use after Museum of the Bible had acquired, well, Hobby Lobby had acquired these objects and was preparing to donate them to the museum. Had there been blockchain in use, none of that would ever have happened if they had been the fragments had been documented. So what have we learned from these four cases? Number one is that there's no really complete inventory of ownership, title, or even possession of artworks. There are catalog raisonnés, which record the work of a particular artist, but they're not complete and they can be filled with errors. Uh, the word that we use in the field is provenance. Provenience means a find spot. Provenance means the history of ownership or possession. And that's generally used to sort out whether an object is legitimately on the market. And in, it's often lied about for purposes of disguising that something is fake, which we've seen in some of the big fake scandals, or that something is stolen. We've seen in two of these cases the prevalence of false documents, which is also very common in this area, and the fact that there's little or no genuine information. So with objects stolen out of the ground, that remains a problem to document. But for objects that are in the market, in collections, in museums. Blockchain holds great promise for limiting theft and the movement of stolen objects. So with that, oh, I'm sorry, here what, I'm not 100% sure that these are the fragments that were the subject of the return to EES, but MOTB did return fragments to EES, and there were some fragments where it wasn't clear whether they came from EES or Egypt, and the Museum of the Bible has returned those to Egypt. This is the ground I intended to cover, so we've got a couple of minutes left for questions if anybody wants to brave uh, the chat function and ask a question.
We do have one question. It says, "This is so interesting. It makes me wonder how much was stolen from ancient architecture or how much we really know about it. Is there any estimate about this?"
That's a great question. Uh, it comes up all the time with regard to antiquities and also with regard to Nazi looting, because the losses during World War II and the Nazi era numbered in the millions, and many of those were returned after the war. Those also number in the millions. I just can't get into numbers. Um, all we know is that the numbers are vast. For example, an issue that's come to the fore recently, was always around, but has come to the fore, is looting from countries that were colonized. And it's now estimated that 90% of the artifacts, antiquities from sub-Saharan Africa were stolen. 90% were stolen. So we're talking about tens of thousands of objects just from there. And of course, objects were stolen wherever there was colonization. As with Cyprus, more than 200 churches were looted and stripped of their iconography. They had icons. Cyprus remains very famous for its painted churches in the free area, but in the occupied area, they've been stripped. So there's no way to get any estimate. If you, I'm sure you can find things to read about this, but it's most productive to read about one area, like let's say the Belgian Congo, what happened there, or Nigeria during colonialism. Much is written about Cyprus. I think for Cyprus, the estimates run I don't know, 3 to 5,000 objects stolen, all the churches, all the private collections, all the private museums, and then maybe 2,000 of those have gone to Europe for sale.
We have some more questions too. Is there any way to use blockchain to prevent fraud?
Well, yes. I'll give the example of the Glafira Rosales fakes. She was an intermediary between what I have to say is a very mediocre but prolific fraudster who painted about 60 paintings from more than half a dozen artists. And they were marketed, Rosales marketed them to the Nerdler Gallery, which was one of the most prestigious, I think the longest running gallery in New York, and another dealer named Julian Weissman. So it was about 40 to Rosales and 20 to Weissman. And in many of these cases that I'm aware of anyway, I handled one of these cases, but in many of them, there was a false provenance, which made it hard to investigate the history of the object. And so if there had been a blockchain for these objects, it would have shown no history. Unless it was fraudulent itself, it would have showed that the objects were born yesterday. somewhere on Long Island, the product of this fraudster. So it's a perfect example of where the fake provenance was assisting the selling of a fake. You got one more, Ellie, or you need me to move on?
I have one more. Let's see. Are there any disincentives for people participating in the purchase of illicit objects on the seller end?
Um, the disincentives on the seller end, uh, yes. On the buyer end, obviously, it's the loss of your investment and the loss of prestige for a museum. So people are becoming more and more careful these days, and they have been for the last couple of decades. Uh, on the seller end, of course, there's a risk of criminal prosecution. U.S. law enforcement is becoming much more active in enforcing laws related to um, bringing stolen objects into the United States. I didn't mention that in the Cyprus case, these mosaics came out of an occupied area, from a church in an occupied area. U.S. Customs wouldn't do anything about it. So it's kind of a disgrace at that time in around 1989, 90. Now Customs is all over these things looking for illegal imports or imports of objects that are stolen. But of course, they don't necessarily have the documentation to support it. So yes, on the seller end, I mean, a seller was also a buyer. So the seller, if the seller loses the object, let's take the Sevso silver case where the seller didn't lose the objects because no one else had proof of ownership, or the Baden-Württemberg case where the seller had made a small investment buying this book on a very questionable market. They lose their investment, they risk law enforcement action. And EES, I don't want to comment on because it's still current, but whoever was involved in the theft from EES is at risk.
Do you have time for one more?
Sure.
Okay, let's see here.
I'm just poaching on whoever comes next.
In your experience, how open are the cultural institutions you work with to adopting new technologies such as blockchain?
That's a terrific question. I've been working with a group that's centered in Cyprus because of my connections there, that's really funded by the EU and looks at all sorts of new technologies, photogrammetry, which is using a computer to recreate images. You may have seen Project Mosul, where people took hundreds of photographs and recreated high quality images of the antiquities that were destroyed by ISIS. Um, you have paper analysis. When I started work in this area, dirt could only be viewed in a general way. Dirt on an antiquity, now it's like DNA. You can figure out very closely where things come from. So people always say in the authenticity area, a determination of authenticity is a three-legged stool: provenance, uh, uh, forensics, and connoisseurship. And the forensic leg of the stool is becoming um, much more important. If you understand that, it means connoisseurship is this appreciation of the aesthetics, which used to be the dominant factor in authenticity. And it was always a little bit questionable. Well, is this Titian or Sculla? I don't know. So the forensics is a huge aid. There are some scientists who are really moving to the fore. Sotheby's, I know, hired one of the best scientists in the area to be on its staff. I'm not sure if he's still there, but I think we're seeing much more attention. I think you can guess from the things that I'm saying that these better practices are adopted more at the top of the market, and they're more applicable to more expensive objects. So it's a long way before they'll be fully adopted. And blockchain is one terrific technique, and we're celebrating it and studying it today. But there are others, such as putting DNA on surfaces, uh, putting on little radio frequency devices on museum objects that can alert a watchroom whenever they're stolen. So these are all expensive, they're all innovative, but blockchain has a great deal of promise, and I expect it to make great inroads over the next 5 years.
All right. Thank you. John, do
Well,
you have
well, thank you, everybody. I hope that was real applause in that, Cam. Thank you, everybody. And thank you very much for your interest and for getting up early to learn about these things. And thank you, Ellie, for well-organized conversation.